is not only the story that we are hearing, that we are presenting here is about the research paper, but we have much bigger story, and we will try through this presentation, as we will see, to present you a story through pictures, a story of fighting, a story of solidarity, a story of hope. And next one, not really. Okay, thank you so much. Jumping to the structure very briefly, of course we will give you some introduction, because for those that are not so familiarized with the situation nowadays, it's very important for you to understand the historical context of this situation, what happened in the past that actually influenced so much what is being happening nowadays in the present. And after, just very briefly, some of the kind of methodology that we used during our research, and going briefly through the general standards review, because as I said to you, our purpose was not properly making a very deep analysis on the legal framework, but still we need the law. It's there, and it's good for us to understand how this law is being applied in practice. But the more important part will be our main findings, and we'll finalize our presentation with some conclusions and recommendations. And these recommendations will be delivered in two different levels. Firstly, in the international level for the United Nations, and after in the second level, more domestic, to the government of Ukraine. So now I have the pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Christine.
Thank you very much. To start with preliminary information about the situation going on in the Ukraine, and not only in the territory, but also in the region as well. It is worth noting that starting from February 24 this year, the armed conflict started in the territory of Ukraine, waged by the Federation of Russia. So this is why the International Organization of Migration started to initiate some assessments just to evaluate the situation and the people who were suffered from the war in general. Since the beginning of the armed conflict in Ukraine, it is estimated that 11 million people were displaced, and they were forced to move from their cities, from their villages to another ones, mainly to the western part of the Ukraine. And some of them, unfortunately, could not commit to that because of some of the problems connecting with their personal reasons. And due to these factors, many civilians try to reach out to the civil society, international organizations, and many other entities to get help, to get assistance in some way. And this shows and still showing how all these systems are working in general in essence, because all these people and state government and civil society are basically the two main entities that are responsible for this situation, and within this situation to get the main assistance to these people that were displaced. Basically, in the refugees, the internally displaced people are internal refugees. Who, in case of crossing an international border, they will be recognized as refugees. But many of them did not commit to that, as I already mentioned, as due to their personal reasons. The relevance of this topic and the war mainly going on in the Ukraine is the greatest example of how civil society and INGO system works. And more of that in terms of the topicality of this problem, it should be noted that almost all post-Soviet countries have faced and are still encountering with this problem of territorial armed conflict, and therefore they are suffering until now to some extent. And at the end, just to give some information about the international standards and etc. At the end of the previous century, in the 1990s, due to the slow and the international crisis of the in the problem, in the challenge of internal displacement, the UNHCR was established. This is why in the continuing years, right after the Second World War, the security and the strategies of millions of displaced people were became more relevant and became more important than it has ever been before. And the developments have been identified. One of the significant problem, as it has so many challenges on the path of being solved by the international organizations and other international entities. And this is why one of the most pressing issues in the present age is this internal displacement. And as a result of armed conflicts, already over 70 million people all around the world are displaced. And lastly, during the last 2 years, especially during the last 2 years, the number of IDPs has increased very drastically. It included the territory, armed conflict in the territory of, for example, Afghanistan in 2021, last August, and then this year, starting from February, in Ukraine. And previously, it has been an armed conflict between Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh Republic. So these are the main last incidents that included armed conflict and resulted in the huge displacement of people from one place to another. In some cases, there are problems with the legal sphere. It is worth noting that international standards are very important to develop and also to implement, so that we can get the best result as we try to. Yeah. Regarding the methodology that we used in order to carry out this study, we collected final reports of with information about the humanitarian aid provided in the country and the means that allocated to accompany the IDPs in the different situations and different cases. And in addition, interviews were carried out with, thanks to my two colleagues. Besides, data was collected from reports, and then there were in-depth interviews, like I already said, and our research included 6 interviews with experts and displaced people from Ukraine. So the aim of these interviews were aimed to gain more in-depth information about their situation from inside and from within, rather than giving some international information that may lack in-depth data about the situation in general.
Well, not really. You said how many slides to go. Here you have you can take a look at some of the main documents we reviewed, so you can understand that our research was really in depth. But I guess you're most familiar with all of them. Just like I wanted to refer to some of those that we use in practice, like framework of national responsibility, manual of legislators, and handbook for protection. That's in my practice, they were the main document that we used when doing research on IDPs. And generally, what we figured out from those documents, there is a number of minimum requirements we'd like to assess the response based on. Obviously, there could be much more, but to start from, when IDPs leave, they have a place to stay, especially like in case of Ukraine, where it happened during winter. Obviously, it was such a chaotic situation in case of the war, in case of millions of people moving in different directions. There is a need of special coordinated body that can match needs and resources available. Besides to do this, of course, we need to have some idea of how many people are there and what are their needs. Besides, since resources are limited, obviously, we should check if government is open to receiving support from abroad or private bodies and how good they are in coordinating this. Besides, there is a big thing, I guess, not only in Ukraine and how you identify the peace, because it's supposed to be a fact-based situation, but quite often it is not. So take a look at the situation there. And if there are any legal obstacles that prevent civil society or volunteers or other organizations from acting, then the least the government can do is to remove them. And obviously, there should be at least some plans of how to get the situation better in the long term. Well, one particular dimension that our research was focused on, my colleague Bruno will be speaking about it later, is about freedom of movement in case of internal displacement. And that also goes without saying that to understand what people need and to provide the support they need, we need to get access to that and to ensure that their rights are protected, their lives are not endangered. That's an ultimate thing that should be understood by all parties of the conflict in our case, that the vacations should be organized, or at least the opportunity for people to leave the place where their lives are under threat should be considered and accepted. Well, fortunately, I guess it's not always the case, and my colleague will speak about it later. Then I think we can switch to the assessing the existing situation in Ukraine, because well, it wasn't the first displacement that we had. And to a degree, we can say that the system was prepared, but let's take a look. So first of all, yes, we had something in place, but it wasn't a general policy developed for all cases. It was a gradually evolving response to the displacement we had from Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And all the measures that were envisioned, they were mostly targeted based. So it was kind of narrow focused, and we can see a little bit later the legislation. We have an IDP law, which was adopted not without challenges, because the first version was quite terrible. Thank God it was better, and later on, I think a few months already through the conflict and the displacements, a new one was adopted, which offered the definition of IDP, how we define these people, and established registration procedures and envisioned some guarantees and rights. Although, of course, it's law, so things might be quite abstract there, and many things they are regulated on the level of Minister of Ukraine resolutions or even minor legal acts. Unfortunately, there is no single body, because the social policy is often coordinated through Ministry of Social Policy, that will be in terms of social support and also for registration of IDPs as well. And there is also Ministry of Temporary Occupied Territories, which is supposed to coordinate the response, but according to expert assessment, is not always quite effective. There is one body that is not mentioned here, but is also invest in support of IDP. Previously, it was Minister of Regional Development. But as you see, nothing, single policy, single coordinated body was there. But talking about identification and statistics. As I mentioned earlier, it's based on having a certificate. This certificate is basically a key to all services you can access when you relocate from your original home. It's not that it's really difficult to receive, but yeah, there are challenges because you have to come first of all from list of settlements that are outlined in this kind of Minister of Ukraine resolutions. And if you're not from there, well, sorry. And if you cannot prove that you have ties with those locations, you will not get an IDP certificate and won't have as many rights as you could have. Also, the thing there is that, well, the thing was like all social payments that were cancelled, suspended for people living in the temporary occupied territories. So in order just to continue receiving pension payments, you have to register as IDP even if you're not. So that also kind of distorts the picture a bit. So we don't really know how many IDPs were in Ukraine in reality. There was a unified information database developed through the years. The original purpose was also that it can collect information on the needs of the people and that all NGOs will have access to it. Unfortunately, it wasn't materialized so far. Just the data is stored under the categories of, I think, number of people, number of households, number of people of working age, pension years, children, and people with disabilities. So it maybe gives us a certain picture, but not very much in terms of what they need. And I think one slide is missing, so.
Also as government, one slide is missing.
Yeah, and in terms of shelter, give me a moment. And so main tool of the social policy in Ukraine is targeted monthly assistance, which is paid to all IDPs who apply for it. It's temporary, it lasts for 6 months, but you can extend it, it's usually not a problem. The problem is that it's just $15, so it's not really helpful if you want to rent accommodation. But it is something, and that's what the Minister of Social Policy is mainly responsible for, payment to those centers. IDPs, most of them, they're paid privately because, well, we don't really have much of social housing. Some of the IDPs, they still stay in collective centers that were established after the first wave of displacement. They're not really in good conditions, quite often. And the condition of living there was usually dormitories, so most of the people, if they had chance, they would prefer to live somewhere else. There were some wonderful settlements constructed with the support of the European governments, which were, again, supposed to be temporary, but they lasted longer than that, and the condition was always very good. In terms of more like long-term policy, government started subsidizing procurement of temporary housing for local authorities. This policy was just started to be implemented. Quite often, local authorities were hesitant to apply initially. They didn't know their responsibility, but year by year it became better. But although at the end, just a couple of thousand people who benefited from it. Government also was trying to subsidize mortgages of a full-time net purchase of housing. But again, it was not targeting many people, but people who mostly have to buy a house or just collect something. Overall, as one of our interlocutors told that the government didn't have any tools to respond because for many years the policy was focused on cuts and privatization and it was quite antisocial. And in the end, when there was this opportunity, the necessity to react, they couldn't offer anything.
So now let's take a look at the civil society response. Although government are considered to be as main actor in responding on crisis situation, civil society plays an important role in Ukraine. It was like this during pre-war circumstances. So starting from 2014, when the problem of IDP became like very important one for Ukraine, civil society and NGOs, they worked mostly on needs and protection of war-affected population, of IDPs, of veterans of the war and other vulnerable groups who suffered from the conflict. However, there were like some limitations within the civil society. And firstly, this is the capacity and sustainability of organization, because like a lot of organization in Ukraine, like local one has like annual budget like less than $5,000, which is not a huge amount of money to make a huge work. A lot of organizations are still voluntary based and not like paid labor based, so it also is a limitation. At the same time, there always was a lack of cooperation with authorities and the low level of involvement as a member of organizations. If to go to the current situation, if you are on track with the situation in Ukraine, you must probably notice that civil society plays like really important role in fighting and helping those in need. So in our paper, we decided to contextualize the input of civil society in dealing with IDP. And we found that there are like 3 levels of action of civil society. One of them is international NGO and funds acting in collaboration with national, regional, and local NGOs or with government. You can see like one of the picturesque examples on the slide. It's International Organization of Migration, working with cooperation with local NGOs. Also, like one of the most ambitious project of it is reconstruction of damaged and inhabitant houses in order to provide shelter for IDP, and they are actually targeted to provide like around 1 million of people with the shelter using the damaged property on the territory of Ukraine. East Europe Foundation is the foundation that had the network and cooperation with more than 500 local NGOs, and through this network of NGOs also try to give an input and also dealing with providing IDPs with help. The same system is used with a lot of other international non-governmental organizations. The second level of influence on the situation is like input of national, regional, or local NGO acting like individually on behalf of themselves. So actually, we found out that this dimension was the least developed. So usually these organizations are involved in cooperation with international NGOs, but not that active while acting individually. And this is also because of the low capacity and sustainability and low like weaknesses in management and low level of involvement of citizens. The last level of participation of the civil society is the hugest one. This is the action of and initiatives from individual citizens and activists. And this part actually shows like enormous solidarity and enormous capacity of human capital. There are some examples, like for example, like immediately on the first, let's say, hours of the war, the network of Telegram channels or Facebook groups were launched, and people tried to coordinate themselves, promote the help, and also seek for help in them. And actually, like the motivation and solidarity was that huge, that became like a huge power for the response of civil society. The question that was probably arise now in your minds is how to coordinate this huge human capital. There are some initiatives actually that were focused on coordination of the civil society. One of them is project Where Are You Awaited, launched by Ukrainian railway company, which put a lot of impact on evacuation. But the idea behind it was very good to make a comprehensive help, like also with evacuation, volunteer support, and shelter. But however, the website of this initiative is absolutely not user-friendly, and you cannot actually use it in the full capacity. You can only see the number of free spaces in different regions and telephone numbers of coordination centers. And another one initiative to coordinate the civil society is platform Briefistag, and this one actually was created as pure volunteer initiative, but then government took a look at it and make the let's say country-wise platform. And for this, actually, what they only attempt to create a centralized database for coordination and support. You can find the options of shelter there, and also this is a precondition of getting the compensation for hosting IDP. So if people host IDP in their property, this should be for obligatory registered on this platform. So there is a kind of centralized database of it. However, if you can see, the stimul of having this compensation is really low, because the amount of money per day is ridiculously low. So it's less than $1 in a day for hosting an IDP.
All right. Now I would like to talk about the right of movement and escape. It's something that really is restricted when people are facing some kind of armed conflicts. And as we know in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 13, actually is very clear regarding the right of movement that the people needs to have. But sometimes there are restrictions, as we know. And for that, actually, we have some kind of solutions as humanitarian corridors. And the United Nations see this as a possible option to release people from unsafe situations. And these humanitarian corridors are defined of being demilitarized zones that are established for a period of time with agreement of the both parties that are taking in the conflict. We have some quite effective examples in the past. We have the example of Sarajevo from 92-95. We have the evacuation of Ghouta in Syria in 2018. But what we see usually in these cases is the United Nations is the body that is making these kind of negotiations. So we can say that we can establish some kind of impartiality in the negotiations for establishing these humanitarian corridors that you cannot see nowadays in the conflict in Ukraine. We can have, for example, Mariupol, the city that was and is under siege, and in the beginning of the conflict, actually, Ukraine and Russia took some time in Belarus, and they tried to negotiate some humanitarian corridors to release these people from these unsafe conditions in the city of Mariupol, but they didn't have actually a very strong intermediary body to make these negotiations a little bit more lighter for both sides. And you can understand why, you know. And after even the negotiations are finishing, the conditions were established, they tried to implement these humanitarian corridors, but didn't work so well, because each side was accusing the other side that they were not accomplished and they were not follow what was establishing in the negotiations. And you can see that in the end is always the people that are suffering, because in Mariupol, under such a hard bombardments and destruction in the city, actually you can see in the picture that we presented in this slide. And this picture actually was taken in April 12th. We are already in 31st of May, and the destruction didn't stop. So we can imagine probably this city is actually much worse than is presented in this picture here, because people don't have any kind of help, and they are surviving with very low humanitarian goods. They have the telecommunications very scarce, and they have the hospitals and all the medical infrastructure is very damaged. That doesn't help in any kind of humanitarian help that we need to provide to them. So the states and the civil society, as we mentioned here, our colleagues were mentioned, we have the state and the civil society as the main responsibles to provide this help. But if they can reach the people, you can imagine that it's difficult for them to provide the help that they should, and they have this responsibility to. And one of the main findings that we saw from the interviews and from the research that we made, that actually there were no evacuation plans. And such a simple thing we see in this code. Highways were jammed on the exit, but completely free on the other side. Why not to open those lanes in the reverse direction? You know, such a kind of small details really can make some difference in the long term to take the people from these unsafe situations and to put them in the much better and safe location. So another of the findings that we constated was that the evacuation actually was being done free of charge. But you know that in war, in crisis, we always have some kind of opportunist people. And actually there were these opportunist people were selling tickets. They were trying to provide this idea of transportation, but they were not actually giving it, and was kind of schemes, and they were putting people in these very vulnerable situations. And as we mentioned even yesterday, we have these invisible individuals in the invisible group, the most vulnerable ones, people with disabilities. When the social workers are not going to work because they have their own families and responsibilities, when the war is attacking in your country, you can understand that it's difficult to provide this help with these more vulnerable, and they are actually left behind because they cannot reach train station, they cannot reach the meeting points. And this is a problem that we can solve if we have prevention and some kind of plan to implement.
To do this one part now. So we can try to consider five other criteria we posted before. So first of all, how to identify who's IDP. For first 3 weeks, there was nothing in place because according to the previous legislation in place, they didn't come from the list of supplements in the next or from Crimea. So there was no way for them to get legally recognized as IDPs. There was some registration conducted usually by authorities, by different bodies, but it was on pen and paper, and in some way they even say that it was consolidated, primarily for people who receive accommodation. But again, the accessibility and quality of such information on pen and paper is kind of dubious, I would say. Also, they were all providing some maybe certificates but for different or without proper names of the body responsible. So it was quite confusing for many people. But in 3 weeks, they did some amendments, and it was happened in like a few ways. So first of all, yes, they became eligible for applying for this IDP status. And second of all, given that before it was only social protection agencies responsible, they scaled up. So at least, I mean, not immediately, but progressively, it was enabled to register as IDP through executive bodies of local authorities, and later on through the special application that we use in Ukraine, via. But it took some time. First of all, I mean, for social protection agencies, just some small software updates, but for executive bodies, they had to learn how to use this system. Yeah, okay, I'll try. No. Yeah, so, well, there were definitely problems, how to scale it. The system they used, it wasn't really famous for being really fast before, and it was many million small people applied, and it was lagging again. So there were also all problems with hearings. So it is usually based on your residence. Not everyone lives in the city they registered at. Also, the labor relations is quite informal, so people couldn't provide any contracts showing their connection to the city they were fleeing from. And the same goes for housing contracts. And again, number of IDPs. So by the end of March, so like 2 weeks after it was launched, there were just 150,000 people registered. And by mid-April, it was about 1 million. Whereas by estimates provided by IOM, there were 7 to 8 million displaced. So we definitely have a mismatch here, and it's a clear indication we don't know where IDPs are and who are they. Well, support. Yeah, the first thing that the government did, and it was really helpful in a way that they stopped all these checks, because if you receive some social support payments, from time to time you have to go again and show some document that you're still eligible or apply for extension and say, okay, so during the martial law, you don't need to do it. Second step they took, that they say that when local offices or social protection agencies are not able to process it because evacuation, wars, or other problems, it will be processed centralized by the capital authorities or where they were located at the moment. Another thing that we will have the Idp prepared some special system to encourage people to get vaccinated and something like this. But I mean, it was really limited to the way you can spend this money. They lifted the restrictions, so you have this money, you can spend it wherever you think is good for you. Also, for those people who lost their jobs or their businesses, they were able to apply for one-time payment, $220. And as we see that by the end of the registration period, 4 million people applied for it and benefited. By the end of March, I think, they changed the legislation. And people were able to receive increased assistance, not this $50 as it was before, but $70 to $100. And besides, UN agencies, they started cooperating with different bodies to take responsibilities and received $75 for 3 months for monetary assistance. Although there was some problems because UNHCR software wasn't really much better than the government in terms of scalability. About the shelter, most of the people there were hosted in a makeshift accommodation. There was no facilities prepared, there were kindergartens, there were gyms, there were churches, and while the buildings itself, they might have been provided by the local authorities, they were not prepared, so there was a cooperation with INGOs and local volunteers who were trying to equip them and make life better. As was mentioned before, the host, they were able to apply for support, $50 per person per month, which is fortunate because other problems is not enough to cover the utilities. Those who stay in private accommodation, that is majority, yes, they were looking for this accommodation for different, less distributed in another form, through chats, through prehistory that was mentioned before, but the problem again, that is usually temporary accommodation. You don't know how long they can stay there. Due to increased pressure on the rental market, prices skyrocketed, and many people, even not displaced, they were not able to continue paying so much. Finally, there was a problem with discrimination. For example, they were looking mostly for females or children, and like put in some ridiculous requirements, like you have to speak Ukrainian only or whatever. And as we see, the state has not had no tools to actually affect the situation in the short term at least. The Nova government was always good asking for money, so they had no problems with that. And in terms of some kind of first response, they created this military administration, they delegated some certain things, so when they were not able to do something, they were busy, they did a good thing, they let it go. And finally, there was a coordination office established, coordinating things. We don't really know how to assess it, because they just publishing something, but yeah, we need some insiders information. We received foreign aid, and one of the tools our government was doing a lot. I don't know, like again, how useful they were, but a lot of different electronic platforms, chatbots, outlines. But we'll see, I think we'll revisit it. So now we can move on to the recommendations.
Yeah, coming from all the points that was said by my colleagues and based on the analysis that was made. Can you really summarize? That was made in the frame of our research. We have, and based on the analysis that was made at the end, we have two types of recommendations directed to two different entities. So the first one is directed to is on the UN level and to develop the sign binding instruments that can be, for example, conventions. And these are three main ones are three or four, and these are the obligations and the responsibilities of the states to ensure and implement and enforce the right of movement related to rights, including all the rights regarding, especially for the IDPs, and then obligations of the state to have a more coordinated administrative working plan. And the last one is to establish the national legislation emergency rules for all the IDPs to ensure their right to food, to health, to water, etc. And the second type of the recommendations are recommended to the government of Ukraine. So these are the ones to abolish the administrative obstacles that may exist. They may exist in limiting the possibility of IDPs to reach safe areas after moving from their places of residence. And the other ones are to improve one of the ministries prepared NTOT for coordination of the IDPs protection. And the last two ones is to stimulate development of civil society institutions and to allocate resources of the IDPs rights protection, implementation, and lastly the enforcement.
So as we are run out of the time, you will now experience the fastest conclusions in your life. So to conclude our research, we can state that state wasn't ready to give the emergency response. Civil society response was like really phenomenal and huge. Mostly based on the individual actions and activities and coordinated horizontally. Non-state actors could provide only temporary solution, and the tendency is, there is no development in non-state actors' help. And also, we can observe the lack of information on evacuation and shelter, and also the lack of assistance to vulnerable groups of population. Thank you very much for your precious attention. You can look at the IDP program from the discourse of emergency situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your elaborate and detailed presentation. I want to give this moment to your coordinator, so what, before we can open it up to the people who read your paper and so they can give you some feedback. And I just want to use this moment to communicate to the coming groups that please try to focus on the main aspects of the paper, so that the other aspects like introduction, background, you don't need to elaborate in detail. You can focus on the main findings made, so that you have the time to tell us what it is about. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I would not waste your time. After that presentation, you can understand how this team is talented and for what extent I was happy to work together with this team. And I would like to thank everybody, to say hi everybody, to thank the organizers, to thank guys, Alexander, Olga, Christine, Nuno. Thank everybody. That was impressive. That was great. Thank you again. That's it. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Very great. That was really helpful. You saved that time. So can we have the people who are giving feedback to the this group and please make sure you submit it a bit solvable.
Into the camera.
Yeah, but then
Is it okay?
yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your interesting presentation.
Can you? Yeah.
Maybe, okay. Thank you for this interesting presentation. As our team, we had the pleasure to peer review your elaborate, and we were left with few questions. So no recommendation. Okay. Why were not discussed the aid distribution mechanism for IDPs and how to ensure that aid reaches the displaced in the absence of a central executive body to coordinate efforts in the protection areas? Should I give you just one by one or?
Can you take notes or can you memorize?
Okay.
Yeah, we read this. So it's mostly for you, so you know what that's.
Second, why did the paper not discuss the issues of marginalized groups, at least partially? And the third and last question is, your first proposal is the adoption at the UN level of a binding convention. The question is, do you mean a UN Security Council resolution or a treaty-based convention, knowing the limitation and challenges for each of these instruments?
Thank you, and I'll try to start with one. Like aid distribution mechanism, that could be a separate topic for any research. Unfortunately, we were limited in our time and resources. And well, there was some centralized things that we mentioned. The government was acting as an informational broker, national needs. There were a number of tools where we were trying to coordinate, but also, as my colleague mentioned, it was quite often managed horizontally. So there was a connection between INGO and local organizations, like trade unions or rather who know the situation and they know what it is.
So for the second question, researching the effect on vulnerable groups, women and children and people with disability wasn't actually like our target in this paper. However, as we mentioned, it was obvious during the research that this group can be and at some moments were left behind, and that there is no special protocols or anything on dealing with especially vulnerable groups. And this is actually very interesting point for the further research of this topic. Yes, for sure.
All right, third one. Thank you for such a lovely questions, actually, and the recommendations was really to the camera. All right. So yes, definitely one of the recommendations that we found is that to avoid this limbo on the legislation, on the law that the IDPs are in nowadays, one of the tools that we can explore is a treaty or convention that can make more clear and to deliver these rights in a much more better way to this group of people. Coming from the resolution of the Security Council will be very difficult because I don't see the member states coming with a lot of intentions to have this responsibility on them. So I will say that a treaty convention that will be delivered and presented will have some challenges too, because we'll need to have the signature of the states and the ratification of the states. We should try to go first, probably coming with some measures in domestic law, and after the domestic law, when the states will accept and they will implement these politics in a better way and to create some mechanisms to protect the rights of IDPs, it will be much easier for the international law accept these rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. Okay, thank you. I think are there questions from the audience now? Really quick, make it brief.
Thank you. I cannot do it from here. That's fine. I agree with you. I think it would be great to have a convention perhaps now with this high increase of the number of IDPs, perhaps there might be some kind of political willingness, but it will be no. But my main question is, are you not a little bit too harsh towards the government? I do understand the period between 2014 and 2022. But I think now, in such a situation where we're talking about 8 million IDPs, I think it is natural that it can only be a combination. I mean, civil society, individual providing shelter, whatever else, food, etc., and the government, I mean, being involved in an armed conflict, having to defend the country against the aggression, and then still actually doing quite a lot on the basis of the law. So I felt a little bit in your final conclusions and recommendations that you say that the civil society is great, but the government really lacks a lot of action, coordination, and goodwill.
For that, I think there's something.
Congratulations. I think it was a brilliant presentation, and it's very obvious the work, the competent work that you have put into it. I do have 3 comments / questions. One is your recommendation with regard to getting away the administrative requirements that are being imposed by the ministry for integration in the registration of internally displaced persons. Just last week, they came out with a new set of requirements, and I think that was a very good recommendation, because usually when you flee, there is no documentation that you would usually take. So, and this is normal. So I think that recommendation is very good. So that's my first comment. And this, of course, is very relevant to the other administrative requirements with regard to obtaining protection and assistance from the government. Second point is that you have a specific recommendation with regard to coordination. You know, there is a ministry supposedly that is supposed to coordinate. It used to be called the Ministry for Displacement, but then it became the Ministry of Social Policy. And recently they have actually, and their remit is really IDPs. I'm not sure what the MTOT is. Sorry, please educate me on that. But I would think that the Ministry for Social Policy, which is headed by a lady, I met her already, would still be the correct ministry, and I think it would be more of a matter of streamlining that coordination, which they haven't done much of. And thirdly, with regard to the recommendation on the convention, I very much agree with Manfred, and definitely, okay, Security Council resolution out of the question because of the members of the P5. But I think that having a convention at this point in time does not actually fall within the context of the context of emergency, which your research is all about. It's more of a long-term thing. It takes maybe 5 years, 6 years, more than even to be in a position to have a draft, and then you have all this signature ratification, etc. It's a good recommendation, but it's not for emergency purposes of Ukraine at the moment. Thank you.
I think we have come to the end of the session, unless there's anything. Or you can reply to the comments to go from yours, and then we'll close.
Sure. Thank you very much for such brilliant interventions and the recommendations and the questions. Regarding the first one, I would like to say that we have this internal discussion. And as is normal, we can recognize that the state of Ukraine being in such a situation that he was not expecting. We are talking about a war, and we are talking about a country that is being invaded by other, and we can see that is making a lot of efforts. However, we cannot just rely of saying a lot of compliments when some of the rights still is being disrespected and not fulfilled and not protected. So I see the picture as can always be improved. And what we see is really something as the civil society that is not having any kind of legal obligation to do the work that they are doing. But we see that government, maybe with some more prevention, with more plans, actually could be done a little bit better. Not saying that it's being done something incorrect, but could be some improvements made. And that is, I think, all of us is working every day is to improve what is already being made so far. Nowadays, we reach much more compared to what we reached 20 years ago, but we still have some work to do. And even in these situations on conflict, if states can be ready and prepared, maybe they can already have mechanisms and process they can start in some case where they will be needed.
I can maybe elaborate a little bit more on that. Please do not take it as like we just want to attack the government or something, but we can take it as looking for the shortcomings or points of improvements. Because some of the things that we draw on, they are direct consequences of the government policy, which were quite affected by the neoliberal course that they took previously. And some of the administrative shortcomings, and as Luna mentioned, as our interlocutors suggested that there was no any preparedness plan in advance that they could have them. And the thing is that we were trying to devise many of the reports and documents neither the government nor the civil society in terms of big NGOs, professional NGOs, that are not prepared for this at all. Like even they had budgets for this, like NGOs, but they were facing with this necessity to open new offices, to hire new people, there's problems with procurement, there's all these kind of practical things. And in this case, if we look at the official data, there is not much information. So we know that there are a lot of people affected, but they were helped and assisted mostly by the self-organized group or initiatives, or like is done by the organization like trade union or existing before they had mass membership. And we're trying to look, and like if government obviously is not prepared, as non-government, none from like even the richest country would be prepared to act, then at least they should enable others for them to make it easier. So that's why we're trying to see what are the problems. And of course, it is unfair that one country causes the war, another country has to defend itself and also accommodate the refugees and IDPs. And one of the interesting points that we talked to now introduce was about this kind of responsibility share that I was asking, for example, yesterday. One of the lawyers is working with ECHR, with the Court of Human Rights, on making like the aggressor responsible for displacement through the Article 8 of the European Convention, like privacy and fundamental life, because they are forced to flee. And in this case, it's not only the government whose nationals they are responsible, but the governments who forced them to do it, the violators. So this, I think, that the points we can also try to discuss. And the difference between Ministry of Social Policy, it was already existing ministry in Ukraine, and they're in charge of many things, except, but like in terms of IDP, they're responsible for their social protection. Like Ministry of Temporary Occupied Territories and IDPs, it's like has a really long name, but this is the body that is supposed to coordinate everything. But even the UIDP database is managed by Ministry of Social Policy because it is connected to social payments. So this Ministry of Temporary Occupied Territories is not the most powerful ministry, but yeah, they're trying also something.
Thank you. I think we'll end it here. That was response. Thank you very much. At 2:30, yeah, with the next student presentation. Yeah, so maybe also take the time for the next group to organize so that you can work with the available time and don't need to stretch. I'm just saying 2:30 we'll be back in the room, but also for the groups coming in next.
Yeah.
Yes. just more time for discussion. Sorry for all the questions. We're running out of time, but it's a great one. Thank you.